Before we get to this text, I want to say a word about prophets. What I really want to do is to reiterate what Pastor Michael has said a number of times, and that is that a prophet's main job is not predicting things. Sometimes prophets do predict things, but the main job of a prophet is to hear what God wants God's people to know and to tell God's people those words. That's the prophet's role. And I also want to say a word about farm animals. I grew up on a 81-acre cotton farm down in southeast Arizona. And so what I have to say about farming applies to my background. I think those of you who grew up in agriculture, though, will find something similar in it. It has to do with the animals on the farm. There are two kinds of animals. There's the kind that you plan to keep a long time. Horses are among these. You plan to keep a horse for a long time. Milk cows tend to be animals that you get and you plan to keep a long time. Dogs and cats, when we get them, we intend to have them for the duration. And these animals we often name. We give names to horses and dogs and cats and milk cows. My sister tells me, I don't remember this, but my sister tells me that in 1948, when she and my parents moved from southern New Mexico to southern Arizona, they brought with them a brown Swiss milk cow named Pinky. My best friend's family had a milk cow. Her name was Folly. And so we named these animals. Now there are the other animals, the ones that we plan to sell off at market or that we plan to butcher. And where I grew up, you don't name those animals. If my dad was raising a heifer or a steer that we were going to butcher, we called it the heifer or the steer. We didn't get into a relationship with the animal that was going to end up on our plates. This lamb, this female lamb that Nathan tells David about, is the kind of animal that we name, the kind of animal that we hold close to our hearts. Just as a quick recap of what happened last week, we know that King David should have been in battle, and he wasn't. And he saw Bathsheba, and he wanted her, and he had her sent to him, and he had sex with her. When she became pregnant, David arranged for her husband to be brought from the battlefield back, and David tried to get Uriah, the husband, into his house so there would be a cover story for this baby. But Uriah was too faithful to his call and wouldn't go to be with Bathsheba. And so David gave orders that Uriah was to be killed in battle. And when he was killed, David then married Bathsheba. And God sent Nathan. And Nathan tells David a story, and he says there were these two men. One was rich, had all kinds of flocks and herds, and one was poor. All he had was a single ewe lamb, a single female lamb that he had bought. This man was devoted to the lamb. The lamb lived inside, and the man held it on his lap and fed it from his table. Well, a traveler comes to visit the rich man, and the traveler must be fed. The customs of hospitality demand that he be fed a meal, and the rich man doesn't want to choose from his abundance. And so he takes away what little the poor man possessed. And we have David's response. David is so clueless, so unaware of his self-centered and self-driven actions that he can't recognize himself in this story. His anger is deeply kindled. He says, the man who has done this deserves to die. He said he must make fourfold restitution. This is such a wrong that's been done. He had no pity. And then Nathan springs the trap. And he says, you are the man. Well, here's some of what happens next in the story. Nathan tells David what harm his actions will have on his future and on the future of his family. David acknowledges that he has sinned against God. The stunningly powerful Psalm 51 is described as David's confession to God and his plea for forgiveness. And ultimately, at Yoav's urging, remember Yoav is David's top general, Yoav persuades David that he must go to the battlefield, and he does, and he leads his people in battle, as he should have been doing all along. So how shall we approach this story? We know who David is, but who is Nathan? Well, Nathan is a prophet who serves in David's court. Earlier, in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, David has told Nathan that he, David, will build a temple as a dwelling place for the Lord. And after hearing God's instruction, Nathan tells David that he will not be the one to build the temple. And in fact, it is David's son, Solomon, who builds the temple at God's calling. David respects Nathan's calling as a prophet, but Nathan has no power, no protection if David becomes angry with him. It is courage and confidence in God's calling that leads Nathan to tell a very uncomfortable and unwelcome truth to David. So, how does Nathan go about communicating? Well, first, he doesn't shout or yell or challenge. He simply tells the king a story. Second, there's no indication that anyone else was present. This is an awkward conversation that will go best if David is not embarrassed in front of others. I want to tell you a couple of stories from my own experience. When I worked for the Tucson Police Department, I worked in the south part of the city. And for most of the time I was working there, in my beat was an African American neighborhood, small neighborhood called the A Mountain Community. It is immediately south and a little bit east of Cholla High School. I liked working this beat, and I intentionally spent time in this African American community. There was a city park there, and often in the evenings, families would gather. The older people would play dominoes, the younger people would talk, kids would play on the swings and the climbing toys. And I made it a point when I could to be there in the evening to talk to these folks, to talk to them about the neighborhood, to talk about how well the kids are doing, to have a relationship with these folks. There was an officer who was not a friend of mine. He was in my academy class, but he was not a friend. He was just an acquaintance. And one Saturday late afternoon, when the park was filled with families and children, this other officer arrogantly drove his police car through the park over the grass too fast, 45 or 50 miles an hour, with children playing there. And the moms were furious, understandably. And they made a complaint to the shift sergeant about this officer's actions. And about an hour later, hour and a half, this officer asked me if I would meet him on a dirt road out away from this neighborhood. And I did. And he said, "You won't believe it. Those," and he used the N-word to describe the people I had been working to understand and to have a relationship. He said, "Those made a complaint about me. Can you believe it?" And I said, "I'm going to ask you not to use that word in front of me. It's wrong, and it makes me uncomfortable, and it puts you in a bad light. And I don't want you to use it around me." And he spun his tires and he drove off. He was in a huff. And an hour or so later, he called me again and asked if I would meet him in the same spot. And I did. And he said, "John, I don't understand you at all." He said, "Those," he didn't use the word again. He said, "Those people hate you for who you are, and they would kill you if they had half a chance." And I said, "No, you're wrong. You're wrong about that. I know these people, and they know me." And once again, he drove away in a huff. We didn't have a friendship to lose, so we just continued as we were. That's the first story. Here's the second one. When I was in seminary, I had a friend who was in several of my classes. We were study partners together. She and I worked together when we were studying Hebrew and helped one another and tested one another. And in one of our classes, she began to talk about somebody else, a pastor at the church she was attending. She named the pastor by name and started talking about the awful things this pastor had done. What a bad person this pastor was, and all of this stuff. Well, we came to a break, and I found this woman, my friend, alone. And I said, "I care about you so much, and I'm so concerned. It bothers me so much that you speak about this person who's not here. It just seems wrong to me, and it bothers me because I care about you so much." And she sort of made an excuse, and that conversation ended, and our friendship was never the same after that. Neither of those conversations was easy, but I don't regret what I did in either of them. Sometimes it's necessary to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. I know that idea isn't welcome to everybody here. Not very many of us love conflict. I don't like it either. But there are times when the comfortable thing, sitting back and saying nothing, really is the wrong thing to do. This is something, speaking the truth when it's hard, is something that you can really do. I know that to be true, and I hope that you can know it also. And I hope the things I'm going to share will both help you and encourage you. So here are 4 questions to consider when we face those situations. And the first is this one of the situations when it really is necessary for me to speak an uncomfortable truth to someone? One way to check is to ask ourselves what our motivation is. if what we want is to get back at someone, or to embarrass them, or to humiliate them, this is not a time for speaking the truth to them, even if they've hurt us and embarrassed us and humiliated us. Similarly, if what we want is to make ourselves feel better, it probably isn't a time for speaking an uncomfortable truth. See, friends, in one sense, Nathan had it easier because God sent him to David. When we need to figure out, do I have the right motivation for speaking this truth, we can ask ourselves whether what we are about to say is honoring to God. And we also need to ask ourselves whether anything good and beneficial is likely to come from this conversation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what is the truth I feel I should speak? It's often hard for us to distinguish between something which is objectively true and something which is an opinion that I very, very strongly hold. It's important for us to try to see the situation from as unbiased a position as we're able to. Sometimes we have blind spots which keep us from seeing things that are important in assessing what we should do. We need to do everything we can to assure that what we're about to speak really is the truth. Well, third, who is the right person to speak this truth to? Although Nathan had a long-standing relationship with David, and in the past he had given David news he didn't want to hear, Nathan is still taking a risk. David has already shown that he could be ruthless in this situation. Wouldn't it have been safer for Nathan to talk to one of David's underlings? Someone, for example, who didn't have the authority to have Nathan killed? And yet, Nathan doesn't hesitate to go to the king himself. David is the one who must hear what Nathan has to say. When we are confronted with these situations, and my dear friends, we are confronted with them, when we are confronted with them, we need to make sure that we're speaking the truth to the person who needs to hear it, rather than the person who would be most comfortable for us to tell. Well, fourth, how will I speak this truth? Where I come from, when we describe a person who is angry and looking for trouble, we say he or she is puffing and blowing. Note that this is not the way Nathan approaches David, even though what David has done is reprehensible. Nathan tells a story, and he knows that it will make the point to David. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that when you need to speak the truth to someone, telling a parable will be your best strategy. That's not the point. The point is that you need to speak the truth in a way that it's likely to be heard. Notice that there's no indication that anyone else was present. When we have an uncomfortable truth to share, an audience will almost always make it more difficult. When I had the two conversations that I talked about just a little bit ago, there was nobody around that either party would have to posture for. And finally, and maybe more important than anything else, we have to do this important work with humility. Humility will help us not to act in anger, and it will help us to be sure that we have the right motivation for this difficult and necessary conversation. So what if we feel we should speak an uncomfortable truth, and we want to, and then we just don't? Where are we then? Well, friends, I'll tell you exactly where you are. You are created in God's image. You are adored by God. And you'll know more about what you'll do next time when that situation occurs again. See, my friends, when God sees you, God doesn't see a loser or someone who backed out. God looks at you and God sees God's beloved. And that's you. There's probably much more to say about this, but I think I'm going to sum up the whole idea by reminding you and myself that the person I'm about to speak an uncomfortable truth to is someone who was created in the image of God and is loved by God. This will guide our decisions and our actions if we remember it. My dear friends, if you find yourself in a position where you are persuaded that you need to communicate an uncomfortable truth to someone, may God bless you with clarity and courage and humility and grace. May it be so. Amen. Friends, this is the time for offerings. We don't take up tangible offerings during this time. There are plates back in the back for you to place those kinds of offerings if you have them. This is a time to reflect on what it is that God has done for us and what we can do just because we can.